We are now about halfway through the story of the opening of Disney World, which in the realm of entertainment is one of the most significant stories of the last 60 years, as it changed how people relate to the world of film and studio entertainment. These longer, multi-part series are typically stories that I've pieced together over a few years. That is particularly true with this story. I started to shape out a draft of it about 4 years ago, and as the months went by, I'd add elements to it here and there as I came across letters, talked with people, and found new sources of information. But in terms of podcast time, we are still a ways from the opening of the resort. It is, after all, a story not only about the resort, but also about power shifts within the company, with a decreased emphasis on WED and an increased emphasis on park operations. Or you can think of it this way. It's the story of how the company culture started by Walt and Roy gradually transforms into a new culture arranged by those who followed in their footsteps. We are about to move into the messy days of late September 1971, as teams worked to finish the resort. And even for diehard Disney World fans, I suspect that in today's episode, there will be some stories that you haven't heard before. But before we jump into the lovely and fascinating lead-up to the opening of Disney World, I need to thank another round of Bandcamp supporters. We are an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. These are the people who keep this podcast going. I'm grateful to each of them. So today, thanks are going out to Podcast Nerd, BJF4, L. Gloss, ISO, Binny, George M., Skylanth, Prince Sugar, David S., Debbie, and Tom F. And now, the show. The final few weeks were a madhouse. By this point, there were 5 main divisions working on the Florida site. There was a group of operations and entertainment managers, largely focused on training new hires, finalizing job procedures, developing live shows, and making sure as many elements of the resort were in place before it opened. There was the U.S. Steel construction and installation teams dedicated to the 2 hotels. There was a fairly large group of WED Imagineers now finishing attractions, as many attractions such as Country Bear Jamboree and the Mickey Mouse Revue had been created in California and then disassembled and trucked to Florida. Hundreds of WED employees were needed to reassemble and install these attractions into show areas created on site. Many of the animatronic figures needed to be fine-tuned once they were in place in their final buildings. Quote, "We set up the programming console," WED installer Bill Justice explained, "to make corrections and changes to improve the timing, things that we could only guess at until we were in the actual theater." Likewise, another set of attractions, mostly outdoor rides such as the Tomorrowland Speedway and the Skyway, had been produced by Aero Development, a ride manufacturing company partially owned by Disney, located in California. Some of these rides, too, were still being assembled on property. And lastly, there were dozens of subcontractors overseeing thousands of work crews focused on everything from carpentry to plumbing to electrical services. Despite a general feeling of camaraderie between Disney and most subcontractors, some unionized workers still looked to delay construction as a means of increasing their overtime. As work moved to a close and as overtime offered big rewards, union members were particularly watchful of other workers honing in on their turf. Members of the plumbers union wouldn't allow anyone but them to work with pipes. Same for the electrical union, the carpenters union, the millwrights union, and so on, even if WED art directors believed that some of these elements contributed to show design. Bob Penfield, a Disneyland transplant, recalled that Dick Nunes gave him the job of clearing out debris from the Contemporary Hotel, which was a union-integrated project. Quote, To help me along, Penfield said, he introduced me to a construction worker by the name of Tiny, who was about 6'6" and nearly 300 pounds. Dick said that if I had any problems, Tiny would take care of them. By this point, many of the California transplants who had been in Florida for months missed their families, missed the schedule of a regular job. Quote, "The stress of opening a park is very tough on the body because you don't sleep," explained Jim Cora. "You are going day and night, 7 days a week. You don't take days off. You don't take a vacation because you're fighting the clock." But they were all wedded to the idea of opening the resort and creating a park as interesting and as successful as the one Walt had overseen in California. Also, in September, Disney found a new wave of criticism leveled against the resort as it became clear that, for better or worse, Disney would irrevocably change Central Florida. For months, locals had suggested that tourists would overwhelm the road system. Some were also concerned about the environmental impact, but these criticisms were mostly managed as Disney had committed 5% of its initial budget, or about $15 million, towards preserving land and ecosystems. Other people were concerned about the economic impacts of the resorts, particularly in regards to home prices. Land values continued to rise as investors swarmed Orlando looking to build hotels and service stations for the 10 million visitors estimated to visit the area in the resort's first year. A reporter writing for Businessweek explained that in recent months, quote, "more than $200 million in property has changed hands at prices up to 500 times the 1965 value." Some of these concerns, however, were more troubling. Disney was surprised to see a regional uptick in crime, particularly from people coming to the area in hope of finding work. Quote, "We used to spend a big percentage of our time patrolling traffic," explained a police officer. "Not anymore. Home burglaries are on the rise. There are a lot of people drifting through. Some come down looking for jobs at Disney World, give out of money, and break into houses in order to get enough to get back up north." Because of this, a handful of residents were insisting that, quote, "Walt Disney World must help share the cost of solving problems sure to accompany visitors and transients," especially as county officials anticipated additional problems once the resort actually opened. The underlying debate, now coming into the public's focus, was who should pay for additional civic services required to manage the community now that it held a massive resort. The Orange County Sheriff, Dave Starr, saw this as an opportunity to expand his force. He initially requested, quote, "an additional 50 deputies, 20 backup personnel, and up to 20 new automobiles." This request was later downsized to 15 deputies and 3 patrol cars. But even these expenses seemed elaborate to a group of taxpayers who, in a 40-page Chamber of Commerce report, suggested that Disney, quote, "should use its powers of incorporation to establish a police force on its grounds and to exercise police powers." Similar to how the resort was presently developing private water and sewer treatment centers in the southeast corner of their property. It was also noted that Disney was developing its own hospital annex on property specifically to care for injured or ill guests, with medical services provided by Orange Memorial. If Disney was unwilling to hire its own police force to manage their property with its own money, the Chamber of Commerce report suggested, quote, "no law enforcement personnel from any part of the criminal justice system in Orange County should be provided to the Disney facility without compensation." Disney's response, issued through Jack Lindquist, was succinct and direct, quote, "Disney's security hosts are deterrents, not a police force. As taxpayers, we look to the county for police protection, just as would any other attraction." But beneath this statement was a plan that Disney had relied on for months. They hoped that the current problems would fix themselves once the resort opened and brought a larger tax base to the region. That is, Disney believed a large upswell in tax revenue would more than pay for any additional county services, rendering these problems moot after the resort was open. Other issues, however, required unique solutions. As Disney looked over applications for hourly workers, they continued to find significant skill groups absent from the pool of possible cast members. Among those areas missing were portrait artists, the kind that were stationed throughout the park in California. In Florida, Disney would need to train artists to create quick drawings of guests. To do this, they contracted with Rubio Artist in Windermere to train interested individuals in the skills they would need to produce quick portraits in a theme park environment. Disney was hopeful that interested applicants would be able to show a few portraits before enrolling them in the training program. Beyond the artists, Disney could already see other areas of concern with their applicant pool. They had plenty of part-time and casual workers, but they were light on certain skilled workers, particularly trained cooks and those who could work with kitchen equipment. As work continued on the construction site, Nunes held out an olive branch to the WED team, offering to bring WED executive Dick Irvine, who was still in poor health, out to enjoy the opening no matter the cost. Though Nunes and Irvine had butted heads at times, they both had worked for the company for over 15 years before Disneyland opened its gates to the world. Nunes explored various flight options, including chartered aircraft outfitted with medical equipment that would land multiple times. One of the medical restrictions placed on Irvine was that he wasn't to fly above 5,000 feet. Quote, "Frankly, I did everything I could to get him back before the opening," Nunes explained. "I finally got the doctor to say, 'Let me talk to Dick Irvine.'" But the potential complications from long-distance travel were simply too great. From that point, the Disney design team in Florida understood that their longtime leader was now, quote, "a very sick man." Nunes would later claim that this was one of his greatest disappointments in opening the park, the absence of Dick Irvine. With the stress of opening, it would be, quote, "the one thing I cried about because he was a great guy." But the absence of Irvine changed the environment of the Florida crew. It shifted more of the responsibility and the burden for opening onto Nunes, casting him at the age of 39 as one of the central figures, if not the central figure, overseeing the largest construction project in the country. In later years, Disney executives would explain that their plan was to open the resort during the school year with the understanding that robust crowds wouldn't arrive until the winter holidays. But if this was their plan from the start, they did a poor job of communicating it to the press. Clearly, Disney had arranged October as a preview month, something like a soft opening for a Broadway play, in which crowds wouldn't overwhelm untested rides and a recently hired workforce. But they expected the Magic Kingdom to draw a sizable audience. All summer, the company had floated a healthy attendance range to the press, specifically, quote, 20,000 to 30,000 or more visitors each day after the park opened. These numbers were likely extrapolated from surveys Disney conducted with, quote, big city travel agencies in Baltimore, Washington, New York, and Dallas to gauge upcoming travel patterns for tourists visiting Florida. Inside the company, internal correspondence aligned with the belief that crowds would likely appear in October as the resort opened. These projections can be traced back at least to a July 27th letter in which Vice President Don Tatum, believing that the park would be sufficiently full with guests and press, requested Disney employees not to attend. Quote, "We are asking," he wrote, "that all members of our organization who are not requested to be at Walt Disney World during the month of October plan not to visit there until after the 1st of November. Outside of Disney, the local Chamber of Commerce, along with an innkeepers group called WAVE, had data points suggesting a, quote, large number of tourists were expected for opening of Walt Disney World on October 1st. Believing crowds would quickly descend on Orlando, hotels added extra staff and expanded their, quote, facilities in anticipation of the October 1st opening. Dozens of hotels formed, quote, a referral service to handle the anticipated overflow of visitors from Walt Disney World unable to obtain lodgings at their first choice hotel. The highway safety director explained to the state that the opening of Disney World posed, quote, the greatest challenge the Florida Highway Patrol has faced in its 32 years of handling traffic. He didn't specifically mean the opening month, but rather the, quote, several million visitors that are anticipated during the first year and the staggering 6 to 12 million that are expected during the second year. Like other law enforcement divisions, he used this opportunity to request additional service personnel, precisely 23 patrol officers. Unlike other enforcement divisions, he was given money to cover the majority of his request. He received a budget to hire an additional 19 patrol officers, and until those officers could be completely trained, the state would transfer 20 existing patrol officers from other areas of the state to Orlando to help manage traffic during the first half of October. Still, Nunes and other managers didn't know how many guests would arrive on the first day of operations. Their data points by mid-September now suggested that it might be a smaller event than initially hoped. But in a world before the internet and before most hotel chains tracked future bookings with software, attendance for opening day was at best an educated guess. Local papers speculated that despite the event being held on a weekday during the school year, large crowds would descend on the park. But Nunes understood that these projections discounted one important consideration. Disney had already cannibalized the local market to build goodwill with various organizations. Not only had the big Labor Day event brought in many who potentially would have attended opening day, but various public relation tours intended for business and government professionals repeatedly produced unexpected results. During the first week of September, when the Disney public relations team had arranged a tour for the local Chamber of Commerce, they found that, once again, business professionals not only brought their wives, but some brought their kids as well. What should have been a small group walking thoughtfully through an unfinished park turned out to be a couple hundred curious locals. This, too, no doubt, cut into the pool of potential visitors who once would have been interested in walking through the gates on October 1st. As the midpoint of September came and went, Nunes understood that there were tremendous jobs left to complete, many of which were focused on training new hires. Though initially, Disney believed that training in Florida would proceed roughly as it had in California for years, they quickly discovered that residents in Southern California, having grown up in the shadow of Hollywood, had an innate sense of showmanship that was not present in the same way for many raised in Central Florida. Beyond this, other training issues surprised many longtime Disney managers. Young adults in the South over years had been encouraged to be deferential to elders, referring to them by either their surnames or by title, very much out of step with the first-name familiarity encouraged by Disney. Quote, "One of the things we had difficulty with," Tony Rhodes explained, "was calling supervisors by their first names. Everyone said sir or Mr. and would get instantly corrected." Some of those doing the training saw the lack of familiarity with urban culture as a benefit. Quote, "Whereas Anaheim and Orange County is a worldly part of Southern California, moving fast all the time," Disney trainer Valerie Watson explained, "early on Disney World was innocent, laid back." Many of these applicants looking for their first job also fit a hiring pattern established at Disneyland, where the park tended to hire college students as hourly workers who hadn't been yet molded by a non-Disney work culture, and then promote from within as salaried or supervisory spots became available. Whether this lack of familiarity with entertainment culture was a barrier or a boon, Nunes could see that training would need to expand before the resort opened, with perhaps some sessions held off-site. In his view, training remained essential, as Disney was selling a certain kind of experience. Attractions such as the Hall of Presidents presented guests with a sense of wonder. The grounds and architecture, such as the castle, provided a sense of awe. But cast members ensured that guests were happy. Though a cast member's task might be to sell hot dogs or to make change, their ultimate role in the park was to ensure that guests found a sense of joy and contentment. Nunes knew that it took time and training for new hires to reimagine their role from one of finishing tasks to one of caretaking. This was a paradigm shift in that it asked new cast members to reconceptualize what it meant to have a job. At Disneyland, back when the park first opened, Nunes and his manager Van France had handled training in small groups, personally introducing new hires to a work culture focused on hospitality, where customers became guests. But here in Florida, Nunes' training crew was attempting to introduce thousands of new hires to these concepts and to their roles in the park over the course of a few weeks. Beyond the concerns of training, Nunes was also aware of practical limitations, specifically that there weren't yet enough uniforms for these 6,000 new cast members. In terms of construction areas outside of the hotels, Nunes kept a running list of projects not yet finished. He specifically cited, quote, inadequate dressing facilities, break areas, cafeterias, transportation, and office space. By no small miracle, the majority of outdoor areas in the park were done or near done, with the exception of Tomorrowland. Nunes was aware that a handful of attractions remained behind schedule, as did landscaping. Beyond this, the monorail still had some bugs to be worked out, the parking lot and guest trams also had trouble, and none of this was lost on the local press. On September 5th, a local paper explained to readers that the Magic Kingdom likely wouldn't be finished when the resort opened, thereby giving locals realistic expectations as to what they would experience in October. Reporter Dick Marlowe explained, quote, the doors will open at 10 a.m. on October 1st without fanfare. The reason for the lack of hoopla is that the park will not be complete. Work will still be going on in several areas of various lands. While Adventureland, Frontierland, Liberty Square, Fantasyland, Tomorrowland, Cinderella's Castle, and Main Street USA will all be open, there will be some work going on in certain areas of each segment of the park. Following this report, Disney also advised some local groups who had previously arranged for a visit during the first 2 weeks of October that the park, quote, would not be ready for guided tours at that time as previously planned. Instead, these tours were rescheduled for early November, as by then, Disney officials hoped that the Magic Kingdom would be better prepared for large groups. These announcements, no doubt, further depressed opening day attendance, as some locals would elect to view the park once it was done rather than on opening day or even during opening week. By this point, some Disney managers believed that a soft opening with a modest crowd might be a blessing in disguise, an opportunity to fine-tune a yet-to-be-finished park. The park presently employed 6,000 individuals, with about two-thirds scheduled on any given day. An initial crowd of 15 or 20,000 would offer the park roughly a 3-to-1 guest-to-employee ratio, a number far too low to be sustainable in the long term, but a number that would create a training buffer so new hires could practice their roles with paying guests in the park. In mid-September, some more elements for the resort came together: boat drivers and monorail hosts, cast members who wore character costumes, and those who would eventually give guided tours. One success story was the Fife and Drum Corps arranged for Liberty Square. 2 months earlier, when it was apparent that there were no professional fife players in Central Florida willing to work at the park, Disney had made the unique decision to hire a band leader, George Carroll, who had experience with the Army's Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps, and then to train locals, some of whom had never before held an instrument. Quote, "We will provide all the training," Carroll had explained to local residents, in addition to fifes, practice pads, and sticks for drummers. For 10 weeks, he'd held classes 3 days a week, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings, to train a group to perform daily shows in Liberty Square. By mid-September, he had a group of mostly teenagers who were starting to sound like a performance band, even if their playlist was focused on standards like Yankee Doodle. Looking over his accomplishments, Carroll said, quote, "I've already outdistanced my ambitions for the group. Already it's beginning to sound like a core instead of a bunch of people practicing individually. I think we'll really make the square believable." Now that the resort was nearing completion, other companies purchased land next to the Disney parcel to create hotels, restaurants, gas stations, and convenience stores. With only 2 hotels on property, Disney needed some hotels, such as Hilton and Howard Johnson's, to support their business model. But other developments, arranged as all-inclusive resorts, presented direct competition. The largest of these proposed resorts was a $1 million hotel and leisure complex featuring an 18-hole golf course, a campground, multiple swimming pools, a 22-story hotel, and a 650-foot observation tower similar to Seattle's Space Needle. Called the Carolando Tower, this proposed observation spire situated at the edge of the Disney property would offer stunning views into the Disney resort, particularly of the fireworks. Though the tower would never be built, its announcement put Disney on notice that large investments beyond simple hotels were headed to the area so long as the Disney resort proved a success. Beyond the Carolando Tower, Arnold Palmer announced that he would build a set of luxury condominiums next to his Bay Hill Country Club. A group of investors announced plans to build a 1,400-room motel complex, tentatively named Court of the Flags, which would combine buildings owned by multiple chains, including Sheraton and Quality Inn, into a combined development. Most notably, though SeaWorld had not yet fully committed to opening a marine park in Orlando, they had purchased land and had negotiated with government officials to create roads that would connect the freeway system to their 125-acre parcel. At the time, the SeaWorld development was presented as a zoological park focused on marine life with shows featuring dolphins, seals, and whales. It would have no rides and was described as a 5-hour or half-day experience. Executives at SeaWorld would wait, perhaps wisely, until after Disney World opened to see tourist interest in the area before fully committing to build. Like many of these investors, Howard B. Johnson, whose firm was quietly developing a Howard Johnson's hotel on Disney property, was deeply optimistic and believed that tourist interest would exceed supply. Quote, "We feel the number of rooms in the Orlando area will be in the range of 11,000 to 12,000 by the end of 1972, he said. But even then, we believe there will be a shortage of 4,000 rooms during Disney's first year of operations." As opening day approached, Florida officials were increasingly concerned about the possibility that traffic would overwhelm the road system around the resort. Recent studies forecast that out of the 10 million tourists expected to visit the resort in its first year, only 1 million would arrive by air. A few would arrive by rail, but the vast majority would come by car. Even those that arrived by air would largely come through the Tampa International Airport, as its facilities were far larger and more modern than those at the Orlando Jetport. Nearly all guests arriving in Tampa would also rent a car to travel to Disney World, adding to the congestion around the resort. By this point, Highway 192, which led to the resort's entrance, had recently been widened from 2 to 4 lanes to accommodate tourists, but most other road improvement projects were scheduled for upcoming years. Believing that traffic would prove a significant problem for Disney World's opening, the Florida Highway Patrol established a traffic command center to be staffed from 10 until 6 daily, coinciding with the operating hours of the Magic Kingdom. The Highway Patrol would use the one helicopter they owned to monitor roads from the sky. During the first week or so of park operations, they would also borrow 3 more helicopters from the National Guard to identify road problems as they happened. They were also looking to arrange a helicopter pad closer to the resort to minimize the time traveling by air from downtown Orlando over to the Disney site. In terms of a long-term solution for traffic congestion related to Disney World, the Florida State Transportation Secretary proposed that the state should build a $68 million express train connecting both the main airport in Orlando, then called the McCoy Jetport, and the more modern Tampa International Airport to Disney World, a plan that would minimize the need to further expand the highway system in Central Florida. But this plan, assuming a large number of tourists did descend on Disney World, would first need to be funded by the state and then constructed, a process that would take years. One of the bright spots during this period of pre-opening anxiety concerned Disney's ongoing relationship with environmentalists. Even while a few local residents remained concerned over reports that predicted a wave of people would soon descend on Central Florida, including some wild predictions that were little more than fantasy, environmentalists continued with their wait-and-see approach, largely comforted by the fact that Disney, on its own, had set aside thousands of acres to preserve existing ecosystems. Thomas Kimball, director of the National Wildlife Federation, said, quote, "This will be a real test before the world to demonstrate whether planning and technology can create a new urban area where man can live without destroying his environment. If a profit-oriented company like Disney can make this plan work, there is no reason why the same thing can't be done all over America. We have the techniques to protect our environment. Developers and governments should be required to use them." Though during the month of September, Disney repeatedly said that they expected a modest opening, as the date neared, government officials more frequently believed that the resort would see a large number of tourists when it first opened its gates. Sergeant Jim Humphreys of the Florida Highway Patrol warned local residents that they would, quote, "have to make driving adjustments" on the day Disney World opened. He didn't predict an opening day attendance figure, but said that the resort was expected to receive 1 million people a month, which worked out to about 33,000 on an average day, a figure that aligned with one used earlier in the summer by Disney. Even while construction equipment moved through the park, trainers looked for ways to communicate the grandness of the Magic Kingdom to new hires. Like many new hires, Darlene Kennedy, a teenager who found a job at Tomorrowland Terrace as the result of a local beauty pageant, couldn't conceptualize the difference between the new Disney park and a large state fair. Quote, "I didn't know what a theme park was, really," she said. "I'd watched Disney shows on TV and still didn't know what that meant to this area." But one evening, managers took her and other recent hires on the elevator that lifted halfway up the castle. From there, Kennedy was led outside on a balcony beside turrets, where she could see down Main Street as popcorn bulbs flickered on. Quote, "And the twinkle lights were twinkling," she said, "and Main Street had lights on." And in that moment, she understood the depth of artistry that made this place unique. Elsewhere in the park, trainers worked with young people on basic job skills, as for many, this was their first job. In stores that were finished, cashiers practiced making change, as in a world before credit cards, all transactions were handled in cash. Heather Will Brown, who was 17 at the time, recalled that the cashier training took place during the 7 days leading up to the opening. Some training was also held one town over in Windermere, where Disney had rented the town hall, as with construction continuing on property, they didn't have adequate finished space to train the thousands of hires who would work the Magic Kingdom. At the town hall, supervisors explained procedures for attractions and food service. Some held classes in Disney traditions, others held classes in first aid. And many explained that from costumes to themed environments, Disney World wasn't a business so much as it was a show. Cast members weren't simply operating rides or working in shops, they were participating in a continuous show that covered many acres. The concept that the resort was tied to the world of film, new hires saw, extended far beyond the art directors who had designed the lands and the craftspeople who had created themed elements for the park. These elements extended to retail space as well. In this, some cast members were introduced to a purchasing agent named Otto Raby. Otto Raby oversaw stock for various themed shops, including the not-yet-finished Old World Antique Shop. As a college student, he had studied motion picture design at the California School of Art, with an eye toward working eventually in film production. Instead of a career in film, he applied the concepts of set construction and set dressing to various stores in New Orleans Square at Disneyland, making sure that even the items for sale contributed to the themed environment. At the Magic Kingdom, Raby was now applying these same skills to the colonial shops in Liberty Square. Quote, "Our shops are essentially attractions for our guests," Raby said. He explained that antiques themselves could be viewed as a type of physical storytelling in which each object suggested a narrative attached to history. Quote, "If antiques could talk," he added, "they would put novelists out of business." For cast members recently hired, this approach to retail space was revolutionary, suggesting that there was possibly no space inside the park that wasn't attached to a show. By this point, Disney had largely filled service positions in attractions, shops, and restaurants, largely with high school students and recent graduates. They had also hired telephone operators, warehouse workers, and security. But despite receiving over 100,000 applications, they still couldn't find enough trained or interested workers for two key areas. The first was kitchen staff, specifically cooks, assistant cooks, and kitchen maintenance. The second was full-time custodial. Up until this point, Disney had mostly relied on word of mouth and the local press to attract applicants. All Disney needed to do was to contact the local paper, and the next day, they'd run an article at no cost to Disney that those looking to apply for certain jobs should drop off a resume at the Disney employment trailers on State Road 535. But now Disney was growing desperate. For these positions, they placed large ads in local papers with photos and graphics, with the text explaining that these positions would come with paid vacation, medical insurance, and other benefits. Once the ads were in the papers, Disney hoped for the best. But a hopeful sense of anticipated change wasn't limited to those working for Disney or those building hotels and marine parks. Out in the community, some members were beginning to see that beyond traffic problems and police services, Disney World had the potential to transform the nature of their small town. Disney found pockets of support, particularly in teenagers and those who admired movies. They found small business owners who anticipated a larger customer base. They also found an unlikely group of locals who were interested in creating the first independent travel information center specifically focused on the Disney resort. Reverend Ernest Pretch of St. Paul's Lutheran Church understood more than most that Orlando was soon to be a central destination for much of America. Quote, "I saw a need for information," he said, "and thought it was our way to offer a little hospitality." At the end of the summer, Reverend Pretch and 8 congregation volunteers sent packets of information about Disney World and the Orlando area to interested Lutheran churches all over the East Coast. He also set up a centralized phone center and reservation system for hotels in the Orlando area. By the end of September, he hoped to expand the group to 20 volunteers who would act as hosts or hostesses for those planning trips to the resort. Initially, he saw his work as outreach to other like-minded congregations, particularly those looking for a family-centered vacation. But then he saw that his team of volunteers might have a larger purpose. Without making a sales pitch or profiting through referrals, they could honestly help, quote, anyone making an inquiry about the new resort, regardless of religious affiliation. It was, in ways, the first non-Disney-owned travel service dedicated to the Disney resort. The Reverend and his volunteers would work with hotels and public transportation, helping those outside of the area to create a Disney vacation. Though Reverend Pritch couldn't yet know this, It was a business model that, if the resort were successful, might expand in the years to come, might eventually, through imitation and replication, expand into a dozen of unrelated travel businesses, all focused on a resort in the center of Florida. I'll be back next Sunday to continue our story about the struggles Disney executives and designers faced in opening Disney World in 1971. And at least right now, the plan is to also create a short midweek episode to explore yet another new experience recently opened at the Florida Resort for its 50th anniversary. And for those of you interested in the early history of the Florida Resort, over on Bandcamp, if you look back about a year, you'll find a second multi-part series on the development of the Florida Resort. Right now, we're mainly looking at the power shift between operations and Imagineering, as well as the lead-up to the opening. But the early years of the Florida Resort contain many stories. Another set of stories involves Bob Foster, who spearheaded the efforts to purchase the land, and General Potter, who developed the land into a usable resort. In that series, we also look at the Wave Machine and the beachside resort Disney considered developing way back in 1971. You can find that series on Bandcamp under the title The Water, the Wavemaker, and the Secret Hotel. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We simply wouldn't exist without the generosity of our monthly subscribers. On iTunes, you'll find about 100 episodes, but on Bandcamp, you'll find over 200, including exclusive stories about Disney World, Disneyland, Walt Disney, and the films that he created. But despite all this, the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can join at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. I'll see you again in a few days. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.